Have you ever opened up your pantry and noticed an onion with green shoots coming out of the top and wondered, if I plant this, do I somehow get more onions? Or have you ever been getting a pumpkin ready for dinner and scraping out the seeds and wondered, can I plant these and get my own pumpkin plant? Well, there are a wide range of veggies that you can grow at home from seemingly free sources. Things like food scraps, supermarkets, cuttings from friends. And in this video, I'm going to show you as many as I can because growing your own food should not be expensive. And one of the cheapest ways to save money in gardening is actually the plants themselves. So if you want to be a more cost-effective gardener, sit back, hit that full screen button, and let's dig in. The first one I want to talk about is not just one crop, but an entire category of plants and veggies that we can do this to. And that's anything where what we're buying is the dried seed of the plant. Which I bet when I say that, not much comes to mind, maybe poppy seeds or something like that. But what you might not realize and are hopefully delighted by is that things like peas and beans and legumes and all kinds of things that come like this, these are actually just bags of seeds. It's just that the vegetable that we eat are the seeds of the plant. And generally for peas and beans and legumes and plants that come like this, when you sow one of these, the plant that will eventually come from it and then produce pods that produce these, you will generally get the same or very similar variety, which doesn't always happen with seeds that we buy from the supermarket. But in general, with all of these, it's a really safe bet that they will. And in fact, these have featured on the channel before, where we sowed a whole bunch of them into a tray to turn them into a really underrated ingredient, which is pea shoots, which is where we harvest only a couple-week-old tiny top shoots of peas that you can put in ramen and salads and sandwiches, and they taste just like peas but have a really nice crunchy texture. But for any of these, you are generally starting them the same way as seeds, although the one extra step I will definitely recommend is just soak these in a cup of water overnight before you then sow them the next day. Because these have been purposely dried out, they will take a little bit longer than normal seeds to hydrate. And the other thing is just sow more than these than you need, because you can't guarantee how long these have been on the shelf or in the back of your pantry. So unlike the back of seed packets where you will have recommended sow by dates, with these you have nothing to go on, so just sow more that you need in case your germination rates are quite low. And if you're trying to garden on a budget, just looking through your pantry to see what kinds of old things like this you might have floating around and give them a go. The worst thing that's going to happen is they're not going to germinate and then you have to buy seeds anyway, or buy thousands from the supermarket for the price of probably half a seed packet. And it also helps if you're someone like me who loves pinto beans but can't seem to find seeds for them around. You just buy this and plant these. And then I can make as many refried beans as my heart desires. The next one is demonstrated well over here in my cucurbit corner with this awesome big sprawling pumpkin plant that unfortunately no one has told it that it's nearly winter. You're meant to be dead already. But the next one that you can probably grow from kitchen scraps is pumpkin. The reason that I say probably is that we ultimately don't know the exact genetics of the pumpkin that you're harvesting your seeds from. And the reason that that matters is one of the reasons that I'm not talking about pulling seeds from a lot of other plants in the supermarket. And that's because a pretty common practice in agriculture is to combine two parent plants with desirable traits through just hand pollinating one male flower onto a female flower. And the seeds that that produces will then grow into a plant with really desirable traits. Say it might be really hardy in the wintertime and still produce big fruit. But one of the downsides of it can be is that due to the genetics of the two parents that you've combined, the seeds from that following plant can end up infertile, which is how we get things like seedless watermelons. And if you've ever heard the term hybrid or F1 seeds, you might have noticed those on seed packets. That's exactly what that is, where you combine two parents, but you can't then harvest those seeds again. But generally, pumpkins are a pretty safe bet that the seeds that you get from those, you're not going to end up with infertile seeds. Ultimately, you can try just about anything with seeds from the produce aisle, but it's just that there are going to be a fair few crops where those seeds are just going to be infertile. A short list of fruits available in the produce section, I'd probably err on the side of not giving it a go, are going to be capsicums and chilies, because those are usually harvested quite early on so that the seeds themselves aren't actually that mature. You usually won't get a plant from them. Zucchinis, kind of the same deal. Cucumbers are usually a hybrid, and the seeds inside cucumbers usually aren't able to germinate. Watermelons and grapes, the seeds inside are usually going to be infertile, and citrus, you can have issues with the variety that you get. But some of the fruits that I've just mentioned, I will teach you a different way to get for free later in the video. Now, a fair bit of the next part of the video is going to be focused on propagation and veggies that you can propagate, but I'm only going to keep it to the absolute basics. If you're like me and into more types of gardening than just growing veggies, like say indoor plants, or I've really started to get back into bonsai, I've really tried to expand my own knowledge of propagating, doing things like air layering, root hormones, grafting trees together, a whole wide range of skills that are great to know as a gardener that I'm not really going to cover here. But if you want a suggestion of where to go, because it's where I learned a lot of what I know about propagation, it's this More Plants Please course from Skillshare, who is sponsoring this video. Skillshare is a platform where you get access to thousands of online courses, and you don't have to pay for each individual one. You just get to pay one fee and have a go at it as much as you want. Or if you're someone like me where you like multiple aspects of things like growing plants, or even completely different hobbies altogether, it's the most valuable subscription on the internet in my opinion. Because over a decade ago when I was in uni, I also did a whole lot of short courses that cost hundreds to thousands of dollars each. Compare that to the price of less than one takeaway meal a month, and I'm super jealous that people now have access to Skillshare. Or if you actually just want to give it a go for free, the first 500 people to use the link in the description will get 30 days of Skillshare for free. No commitments, sign up, learn something, learn about air layering, and then just see if it's valuable enough for you to continue. It was for me. Like I said, I've been a Skillshare subscriber for years before they were ever a channel sponsor. Now let's get back to the video. I'll teach you some really basic forms of propagation so that we can start growing more of our own food for free. Herbs. Generally speaking, most herbs you can propagate by cuttings, and they're generally very easy to propagate because most herbs, there are a few exceptions here, but most of them are actually part of the mint family. And if anyone has any experience growing mint, you know that it grows not even like a weed, more aggressive than a weed. It's a very, very aggressive grower. And one of the reasons that this happens is that this whole family are all vigorous rooters. They are all very ready to just shoot roots out of whatever part of the plant that they need to continue to live. Some of the ones you'll find really easy are mint, basil, oregano, tarragon, thyme. I'll show you how to propagate these in a second, but they're all dead easy. Another one we're also going to add in here, which isn't really part of this family, but it's worth talking about, is rosemary. So a bit of a fun fact about my rosemary is one of the TikToks that I made when I first started the channel was about how you can use rosemary propagations to help as a bit of a natural pest deterrent by pulling off some new growth, shoving it just straight in a garden bed, and then leaving it. It should take root, but because of its smell, also has some natural pest deterrent properties. Well, I actually killed both of my rosemary bushes that were quite large and developed. And because of me making that video and taking a couple cuttings that I had just scattered around the garden, I now got to completely replace those rosemary bushes with one that's nearly already the same size as those before. So even if you already have most of these plants, I really recommend getting into the habit of just regularly taking cuttings from them, because you can give them to friends, you can obviously put them in a different part of the garden, or if one of them fails, you have backups without having to fork out again. I'll give you some tips on where to find these without forking out the cash in a bit, but first let's talk about propagation. Now I'll demonstrate this on basil because it's quite big and easy to show on camera, but these principles will apply to basically all herbs and many more plants that aren't just in the herb family. Generally with propagation, even though it might be tempting to try and grab off a huge chunk of the plant to already start with another really big bush, we'll walk right past that. Anyway, even though the temptation might be to try and jump straight to having another big plant, and there are ways to do that, especially with something like air layering, which I'm not going to explain in this video, we're going to have a higher success rate of getting the plant to take root with younger and more tender growth. So if I take a cutting more like this, a younger, greener shoot with only a couple sets of leaves, this is going to have a higher success rate than if I was to take something like this, which is already quite dark and woody. This material, the cells here, are much more focused on just being able to survive and support the plant than they are on actually growing. Whereas if we take this tender shoot that's already growing, it's more willing to try and shoot out roots. Speaking of which, even though just about everything in this family will have the ability to shoot roots directly off this stem, we still want to try and give it a bit of a better chance than that. And what we can do is by utilizing what's called the growth nodes, which is essentially the little nub of where the leaves are shooting out. So if we tear or cut these off where these leaves are, and then leave, no pun intended, and then if we leave the stem bare with those nodes exposed and then put that directly into water or soil, you'll be completely fine usually putting these directly into soil. The cells that are in these growth nodes are far more prepared to immediately turn into root tissue than something directly on the stem. So you'll usually have a higher success rate by doing something like clearing away these leaves. Another thing that you want to do with propagation is that this little shoot is now in a race against time to try and produce roots that can start sucking up water and nutrients before the rest of the plant runs out of life. And what you can do to help that is to actually just tear away most of the growth and only leaving one set of leaves. Another thing you can do with basil in particular, because it's quite large leafed, is actually cut off about half of these larger leaves. And I would probably leave it like this, and then pop that straight into water or a soil or a propagation mix, and that should set root just fine. You will increase the speed at which it does that and the likelihood it does that by applying a store-bought root hormone, but we're trying to save money here. You really don't need root hormone in most of the cases with these sort of plants. And then applying those same principles to this oregano cutting, we would essentially find the stem, just expose a whole bunch of these growth nodes that we can then stick in water or soil, leave only a handful of leaves at the top so that there's less life for this, so there's less life for the cells left in here to support, and then dunk that straight into water or soil. And in terms of where to find plants to begin with to get these cuttings from, I really recommend just trying to sniff out wherever your local community of gardeners is. Usually things like Facebook groups are an exceptional resource. Probably half the plants in my garden at some stage have come from me just posting in my local gardening group asking if anyone has something that I can take a cutting from. And now that we know how to never spend another single cent on an entire category of produce again, just by asking some friends for some cuttings, I'm sure that that's something that we're definitely not going to do, because that might unfortunately hurt the profits of some big supermarkets. Hey, you wouldn't steal a car, you wouldn't download a movie, you wouldn't take a cutting. The next one is tomatoes. And the great news about tomatoes is there's a couple different ways to get them for free. The first one is if it's not tomato season, but it's coming up to it, you can definitely grow tomatoes from seeds in tomatoes just bought at the store. The seeds are mature. The only big gotcha is that, again, you want to try and find one that isn't some sort of hybrid variety. So try and stick to farmers markets if you can, or err more towards trying to get organic or anything that says heirloom in the title. The other one is if it's already tomato season, and this works especially great if it is early in the growing season, like it will be in, I think, the Northern Hemisphere when this video comes out, is again, if you can find someone else who's already growing tomato plants, you can harvest what's called a sucker off a tomato, which is just this side shoot from a tomato vine that will become its whole own plant when you plant it. And the great news is that when you already have tomato plants, you want to be pulling these off anyway. So anyone that you find that's already growing tomatoes will very willingly give you their suckers. And you don't even have to muck around with those as much as you do with herbs. You literally just rip the thing off, stick it straight in the soil, and you'll have a really high success rate of that thing taking root. And if it's early enough in the season, you will lose next to no fruiting productivity from growing it from a sucker as opposed to starting it from seed, usually in the late winter or early spring. The next one is one that you can actually pick up from the side of the road, and I think a lot of new gardeners are going to be shocked by this, but once you know what these look like, you'll start seeing them everywhere, and that's carrots. And we don't actually want to go and harvest the carrots themselves, but once we're into late spring all the way through summer, you'll notice that you start to see carrot flowers everywhere, and guess what? Carrot flowers just contain carrot seeds. Carrot flowers come out of this quite long stemmy plant and then turn into these really horizontal white flowers. And once you know what they look like, you can just go and harvest them. Now, there's probably one that a lot of people might not do, but I think it's really fun and novel, or at the very least in an apocalypse situation, you'll notice that these things are everywhere. And the good news is, if you're in Australia, you can grow carrots basically year round, so it doesn't really matter when you're picking these up and starting them. And the other thing is that if you already have carrots or carrot seeds, anytime you're growing carrots, if you just let one or two of them grow completely to seed, you will then have your own supply of carrot seeds. Or you can do what I do, and instead of harvesting them, just let some of them go to seed, self-seed everywhere, and then you kind of come back in 12 months' time and you've got carrots in that spot again. Which is much funner than what my experience with carrots have been lately, which is I meticulously sow rows of carrots, and then just as they start to germinate, my cat comes and digs them up. Before getting to the next one, which is here, I do want to acknowledge one which is here that I think a lot of people might be expecting to see on this list, but I'm choosing not to put on it, and that's potatoes themselves. Now, I do already have an entire own video on this, in fact it was my first video on the channel, about why if you take potatoes from the supermarket, why it's not the best idea to then plant those and turn that into a new potato plant, which will turn into more potatoes. And if you didn't know, that's exactly how potatoes grow. Now, you will absolutely get more potatoes from this. The problem is that it starts to introduce some risk with diseases. Now, if you are just a hobby gardener, I think it is completely fine to take potatoes from the supermarket, plant those, have them turn into a plant, dig them up, especially if you have kids, it's kind of a fun project, and then harvest those and then cook those up. What you should not do is continue to then use those potatoes, plant them again and again for generations and generations. You're just asking to encounter issues with what's called potato blight or early blight, which is this mold disease that ends up in your soil that will contaminate your entire garden and affect and basically kill multiple species of plants, especially things in that family like capsicums, tomatoes, future potatoes, eggplants. That whole family of plants is put really at risk if you encounter that. So in my opinion, potatoes are kind of one where it's worth actually just buying the seed potatoes from nurseries, because there's an entire industry of people who create disease-free potatoes, but they only last for about 7 to 9 generations before they start to become pretty risky with running into diseases. But one that you might think is similar, but is actually in a completely different family of plant, is sweet potatoes. And these are great to propagate from ones that you might already have in the cupboard, because they work a bit differently. Now, you might not be able to tell, but underneath these pumpkin vines, I actually have my sweet potato vines for this year already starting to come through. To propagate a sweet potato, you essentially let it sprout. You can sometimes just get this to happen in the dry, or you just sit it in a bit of water. It will start to sprout a bit of a vine. And then once those are more than about 30 centimeters long or so, you can just snap that off. And you can then put that in water, that'll set root. You can sometimes chuck it straight in soil. But then once it is rooted, you chuck that in the ground. That becomes its entirely own vine. Then in about 6-ish months time, once it starts to die back, you'll then dig it up and you'll have a whole bunch of sweet potatoes. You do need a fair bit of space for sweet potatoes, but in my opinion, they're a really underrated veggie to grow at home. Now, I need you to do me a favor, and that is do not buy this hoodie. And that's because this channel is getting dangerously close to becoming a viable business. And this is the first piece of merch that we're launching, and if you buy this, I'm going to be forced to do things like spend more time making the videos that you request. I'm going to be less dependent on just getting views to be able to determine what videos that I make. I'm going to have to spend more time interacting with my audience. It just sounds horrible. So if you want any of those things to happen, I guess you could buy the hoodie, but probably not. But it is available right now on the new website, culinarygarden.com.au, which has been, which has taken me about 6 months to make. Who would have known that me wanting to talk about broccoli would somehow turn into me learning how to build a website and learning how to sell hoodies, which, by the way, these are printed in Gippsland. These are like down the road. So you're also supporting like multiple local businesses by buying these. Anyway, back to the video for one that will be, all right, a little bit controversial, but hear me out. So one you'll see a lot online, and a lot of people just try to do without maybe even being told to, just out of their own intuition, and that's taking a spring onion that they cut in half from the supermarket, planting that in some water or even in some soil, and then watching the green shoots of it regrow, which you can then reuse. And you can absolutely do that. That absolutely works. From a gardening perspective, that works fine. You'll be able to harvest those green shoots a couple times, 3 or 4 times or so. I don't really agree with it from a culinary point of view, that in my opinion, the delicious part of a spring onion is the white bit and you're not getting that. But I guess for garnishes and stuff, it's fine. But instead, what I might advise you to do is if you only have a couple of spring onions that you haven't used when you've bought them from the supermarket, and they always wilt super quick, and you chuck them in water or potentially eventually in the garden. And thankfully they do still come with the roots attached, so you can chuck them in pretty much straight away. But let 1 or 2 of them grow all the way through the season to when they get kind of really big like this, and they will actually produce a white flower, which it's actually past the point in the life cycle for most of these, so the flowers are gone. But this flower will then turn into essentially just a whole bunch of seed pods. And again, you can either harvest the seeds, just let them scatter. With spring onions, I really love letting them just scatter across the garden bed, because spring onions are really easy to identify. It's really easy to tell if it's a spring onion or a weed. and then you'll come back the next year. They're really easy to just rip out of the soil and transplant if you want to put them somewhere else. But instead of harvesting some onion greens a couple times, you can literally end up with a lifetime of spring onions if you're willing to let a couple of them go to flower. Which for about the last 3 years, every single spring onion that I have grown in my garden has just come from the volunteers that I get from letting about 2 or 3 go to seed each year. Similarly, onions that are in your cupboard, you won't be able to regrow those and have that turn into more onions, but you can just let it go to seed. And then the seeds that you get from that will turn into more onions in a year's time, where you can then harvest those and actually use those onions. One that I'm not growing myself at the moment, but is just awesome and is totally on my list of things to get happening, and will surprise a lot of people by how they grow. It's honestly astonishing, is pineapples. Because what you can do is, if you have a whole pineapple that still has the leaves attached to the top, if you cut off about the top inch or so of the fruit where you just leave those leaves on top, put that into soil, in about 2 or 3 years time, you will harvest another pineapple from that plant, which will actually grow above it. But if you're ever buying a full pineapple, don't throw away the top. You can literally regrow it into an entire another pineapple. I really hope I can find some footage of how they grow, or else you're not going to believe me. The next one I'm so glad to be talking about, because it's about to be the perfect season to grab it for free, because you can get it from cuttings really easily, but you have to get them during the winter. But before I get to that, I do just want to say a big thank you to the Patreons. If you love what we do here, consider checking out the Patreon. It's a good way to support the video. I'm going to start doing a lot more exclusive content there, and Patreons get stuff ad-free, sponsor-free. But a fantastic thing to get as cuttings for free is grapes. And both of this and this one behind me that I'm trying to eventually train up and over my veranda, these are just grown from cuttings. What you need to do is wait to find a grapevine during the winter when it's dormant and no leaves are left, and you essentially just take a cutting of a branch, shove that in some soil, make sure that you are putting the bottom end of it into soil, and then you just leave that to spring, and you will eventually have whole new grape plants. It will take a couple seasons for these to get to fruit, but hey, they're free and very low maintenance. I hope you can start to see that growing your own food doesn't have to be expensive. Yes, it can be, and if this is a hobby that you love, I think it's completely okay to spend a whole bunch of money on, especially buying nice things if you want one of those kind of nice sort of gardens. But once you kind of know what you're doing and know what to look for, plants are by far the easiest place to save money when it comes to gardening. In fact, you can start to hit this kind of critical mass, which my garden is definitely at, where it starts to just sort of self-propel itself forward, and you really don't have to spend much money on it. And in addition to getting plants for free, trying to garden this way is a really great way to also meet some other like-minded individuals, literally make friends along the way by asking them for cuttings. The amount of people in my community that I've engaged with just because I really didn't feel like paying $20 per grapevine cutting, as opposed to going to someone's house for a morning, getting a really cool tour of their garden, and even seeing their chickens and ducks and getting some free eggs at the same time because they happen to have too many on that day. That's so much more fun than just going to Bunnings and handing over $40 for a couple of seedlings. And I hope I've proven that point by now, but if not, here's a quick fire round of some extra fruit and veg that you can start to look into that are pretty easy to get for free or to propagate. Fig trees, you essentially cut off a small branch, stick it in soil, and you will get a whole nother tree. Garlic, you literally take a single clove of garlic, shove that in the ground, and that will become an entire own plant that will produce its own bulb. And guess what? In the Southern Hemisphere, right now is the correct time to plant them. Strawberries, if you know someone with a strawberry plant, you now have strawberry plants, because strawberry plants shoot out their own runners that you can then just come and snip off and take home. In fact, that's where all of my strawberries have come from. Gooseberries and blackberries both do something similar. And if there are any grains that you like and want to experiment with growing, like wheat or quinoa or amaranth, you can literally take what you buy in the supermarket again and plant it, because what you're buying is the seed. And you can make your own bread from homegrown wheat. If you live somewhere where water is really available, sugarcane and rice you can do something similar with. Sugarcane, you literally just take about an inch cutting of the cane, stick it in the ground, and it becomes an entire new cane. Which, yes, is exactly how it works in Minecraft. They got something about gardening right. I really hope this video has helped inspire you to get out into the garden and give it a go. Leave me a green thumbs up if it has, and let me know in the comments if there's anything you'd add to this list. If you want to learn more about specific skills like plant propagation, remember to check out Skillshare using the link in the description. Don't buy a hoodie. Thanks so much. I'll see you next time.